A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Imagine you are holding a silver-plated implement that could, quite literally, destroy your entire social future. It is 1875, and you are at a dinner party that has already lasted 3 hours. You have navigated 12 courses of increasingly complex French-named dishes. You are exhausted. Your corset is tight enough to restrict your breathing, and you have spent the last 45 minutes talking to a man about the granular details of his prize-winning turnips. Suddenly, the hostess catches your eye, tilts her head, and pivots her entire body to the person on her other side. In an instant, the entire table of 24 people must do the same. This is the turn, a piece of social choreography so rigid it makes a military parade look like a casual stroll. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the performative architecture of Victorian dinner parties and how a modern couple in 2026 might use these ancient mannerisms to signal an absurd level of social pedigree.
I love this topic. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have been waiting for an excuse to talk about the absolute madness of 19th century table settings. Daniel really hit on something interesting here because, while it sounds like a historical curiosity, it is actually a manual for high-stakes social engineering. We think we live in an era of curated identities because of social media, but the Victorians were the original masters of the curated life. Every single fork on that table was a data point. If you picked up the wrong one, you weren't just making a mistake, you were announcing to the room that you were an interloper. You were a glitch in the social algorithm.
It feels especially relevant right now. I was looking at that Eventbrite social study from earlier this year, the Reset to Real report. It says people in 2026 are desperate for authentic gatherings because everything feels so digital and fake. But the irony is that if you actually try to host one of these pedigree dinner parties, you are creating something that is the opposite of authentic. It is pure theater. It is a performance designed to prove you belong to a club that probably does not want you. We are seeing this massive spike in social anxiety. Global lifetime prevalence has hit about 12.1% of adults this year, and it is up 23% among 18 to 34-year-olds. And yet, here we are, fascinated by a time when dinner was a 5-hour obstacle course of anxiety.
That is the beauty of the bluffer's guide approach. If you want to signal that you have deep roots and old-world sophistication, you do not just buy expensive wine. Anyone with a credit card can do that. You have to master the choreography. You have to understand the hardware of exclusion. The goal is to make your guests feel slightly inadequate while appearing completely effortless yourself. It is the ultimate social flex. The Victorians turned dinner into a high-stakes algorithm where the prize was social survival.
Let us start with the arrival. If you are trying to signal pedigree in 2026, you cannot just have people show up whenever they find a parking spot. In the Victorian era, there was a very specific window, right?
You had to be exactly 15 minutes late. This was the 15-minute rule. Arriving on time was considered desperate, like you had been standing outside the door sniffing the air for the smell of the roast. It implied you didn't have anything better to do. But arriving 20 minutes late was an insult to the cook and the hostess. That 15-minute buffer was the sweet spot of cool detachment, and the entry into the dining room was not a casual walk. It was a procession. The host would lead the highest-ranking female guest, and everyone else followed in a strict order of precedence. If you were a lowly curate or a younger son, you were at the back of the line, literally and figuratively. If you want to bluff this today, you should actually print out a seating chart that looks like a genealogical tree.
And once you actually get to the table, that is where the real minefield begins. I want to talk about the fish knife. This is the ultimate class trap, and it is something most people get wrong when they are trying to look posh. It is the perfect example of how the rules change the moment the middle class learns them.
This is one of my favorite bits of social history. In the mid-Victorian era, someone decided that fish needed its own special silver-plated knife and fork. The middle class, eager to show they knew the rules, rushed out to buy them. But the truly old money aristocracy looked at these people with utter contempt. Why? Because high-quality silver does not react with fish. If you were truly elite, you did not need a special knife. You used 2 silver forks. There is a famous poem by John Betjeman from 1954 called How to Get On in Society that mocks the middle class for using a fish knife. So, the fish knife became a marker of the nouveau riche, someone who was trying too hard. If you want to bluff your way into high society today, you should actually hide the fish knives and just give everyone 2 forks. It is a subtle signal that says, my family has had this silver since the 18th century, and we find your specialized cutlery a bit vulgar.
That is brilliant. It is a double bluff. You are signaling sophistication by rejecting the very tool people think is sophisticated. It is like the modern equivalent of wearing a beat-up old wax jacket instead of a brand new designer one. But what about the physical layout? I have seen pictures of these tables, and it looks like a geometry final exam.
It was highly standardized. You had the glassware triangle, the water glass stayed directly above the knife, the white wine glass was to the lower right, and the red wine was above that. It formed a very specific shape. If a servant moved a glass an inch to the left, it ruined the symmetry. And then there were the knife rests. You could have up to 8 knives and 8 forks per place setting, each with its own little crystal or silver rest. Imagine the clatter. But the most important thing was the charger plate, or the service plate. It stayed on the table between every course until the dessert. If you removed it early, you were basically announcing that you grew up in a house without a dining room. It was a placeholder for your dignity.
And the service itself changed during this period too, right? We moved from the big buffet style to what they called service à la Russe.
Well, not exactly, but you are on the right track. Service à la Française was the old way, where all the food was put on the table at once in massive, ornate displays. It looked impressive, but the food was always cold by the time you got to it. Around the 1860s, Britain adopted service à la Russe, or service in the Russian style. This is how we eat today, where dishes are brought out sequentially. But for the Victorians, this was a massive shift, because it meant you needed a small army of staff. The food was no longer the centerpiece, the service was the centerpiece. You were no longer looking at a mountain of ham, you were looking at a perfectly empty space that was about to be filled by a footman.
It turned the staff into a status display. I read that tall, good-looking footmen actually commanded higher salaries. You were literally hiring human ornaments to stand behind the chairs.
They were like human peacocks. If you had 4 footmen who were all over 6 feet tall and wearing matching livery, you were telling the world that you had so much money you could afford to pay people just to look imposing while holding a tray of soup. And the soup itself was a test. There was a very specific rule about the soup spoon. You never scooped toward yourself. You pushed the spoon away toward the center of the table.
Why? That seems so counterintuitive. If I am hungry, I want the soup in my mouth as fast as possible.
That is exactly why you push it away. Because pulling food toward yourself implied you were hungry. It implied a certain animal desperation for the meal. Pushing the spoon away signaled that you were so well fed and comfortable that the act of eating was almost an afterthought. It was a gesture of supreme indifference toward physical need. Also, you never asked for a second helping of soup or fish. To do so was to imply that the hostess hadn't provided enough, or worse, that you were greedy. If you want to bluff at a dinner party tonight, push your soup spoon away and never ever ask for more. It is a tiny movement that screams, I have never missed a meal in my life.
It is the ultimate performative restraint. Speaking of restraint, let us talk about the menu. If you wanted to look posh, you could not just serve roast beef. You had to call it something else. You had to make it sound like it required a passport to understand.
You had to print the menu in French. Even if you were serving a thoroughly English leg of lamb, it had to be listed as gigot d'agneau. It was a way of signaling that your household operated on a level of international culture. And the structure of the meal was exhausting. You would start with 2 types of soup served simultaneously, usually a clear consommé and a thick bisque, then the fish course, then the remove, which was often a second fish or a lighter meat dish, then the entrees. Now, this is a fun detail for our American listeners. In the Victorian era, An entree was a small, delicate dish served before the main roast. It was not the main event. The main event was the releve, the large joint of meat carried in ceremonially.
So we've gone through soup, fish, a remove, and an entree, and we haven't even hit the main course yet. My stomach hurts just thinking about it.
We are just getting started. After the roast, you had the game course, then the pudding, which was the sweet course. But then, and this is the part that always baffles people, you had the savory course. This would be something like angels on horseback, which is oysters wrapped in bacon, or maybe Welsh rarebit. It was a salty, sharp palate cleanser served after the dessert. It was basically a way of saying, we have so much food that we can afford to confuse your taste buds at the very end. And then, finally, the dessert course, fruit, nuts, and bonbons.
It sounds like a marathon. How did people even stay conscious for 4 or 5 hours of this? I would be under the table by the game course.
That is where the social choreography of conversation comes in. The hostess was the conductor of this entire symphony. She did not just plan the food, she planned the topics. Politics and religion were strictly forbidden because they were too divisive. You wanted a smooth, frictionless flow of pleasantries, and you never complimented the food too effusively. To do so was considered gauche, as it implied you weren't used to such high-quality dining at home, and then, of course, you had the turn of the table.
This is the part that sounds like a fever dream. Explain how that worked in practice, because it sounds like a synchronized swimming routine but with more velvet.
So, you are seated next to two people. For the first half of the dinner, usually until the roast, the hostess would talk to the person on her right. This meant everyone else at the table had to talk to the person on their right as well, or someone would be left staring at a wall in silence. Then, at a prearranged moment, the hostess would turn her head to the person on her left. Like a row of falling dominoes, every guest had to pivot. If you were in the middle of a fascinating story about your trip to the Alps, too bad. You had to cut it off mid-sentence and start a brand new conversation with the person on your other side.
It is so mechanical. It completely removes the possibility of a natural, deep conversation. But I guess that was the point. It was not about connection. It was about demonstrating that you knew how to follow the script. It was a test of social agility. It was the original social media feed, highly curated, perfectly timed, and completely exhausting.
And if you failed the test, if you kept talking to the wrong person, you were creating a social vacuum. You were making someone else sit in silence, which was the ultimate sin. It was a system designed to ensure that no one was ever left out, but it did so by making everyone a slave to the clock. It was also why married couples were always separated at the table. Sitting next to your spouse signaled that you were boring and had no one more interesting to talk to.
What about the ladies' withdrawal? That is another one of those traditions that feels very alien to us now, but it was a huge part of the status signaling. It was almost like a tactical retreat.
This happened after the final dessert course. The hostess would catch the eye of the highest-ranking woman at the table and give a subtle bow. That was the signal. All the women would stand up and follow the hostess to the drawing room. The men would stay behind for port, claret, and cigars. Now, this time apart was a massive status marker. If the men came into the drawing room too quickly, it meant the host was stingy with his wine. If they stayed too long, it meant they were being boorish and ignoring the ladies. The host had to hit a perfect window of about 30 to 60 minutes. It was a way of signaling his generosity and his command over his cellar.
It also gave the women a chance to talk about things the men were not supposed to hear, and vice versa. It was a gendered division of social power. But let us talk about the food traps. There is one specific vegetable that I find hilarious because it breaks all the rules. The asparagus.
The asparagus exception. This is a classic bluffer's tip. In a world where you had a different fork for every single morsel, asparagus was the one thing you were allowed to eat with your fingers. Even at the grandest tables, you would pick up the stalk and eat it by hand. It was a trap for the social climber who thought they were being sophisticated by using a fork. If you saw someone struggling with a knife and fork on a spear of asparagus, you knew they were an amateur. They were trying too hard to be polite and, in doing so, proving they didn't know the real rules.
It is like a secret handshake. If you know, you know. It reminds me of the finger bowls. They would bring out these little bowls of warm water with a slice of lemon at the end of the meal. And there are all these stories about people who didn't know what they were and drank the water.
The legendary social disaster. The finger bowl was placed on a doily on top of a dessert plate. You were supposed to dip your fingers in, pat them on your napkin, which, by the way, should never be tucked into your collar, as that was for tradespeople, and then move the bowl and the doily off the plate so the servant could place the fruit or nuts there. If you drank it, you were a laughingstock. If you ignored it, you were a boor. It was a tiny, delicate ritual that served no real purpose other than to see if you knew how to handle a doily.
When you step back and look at it, the whole thing is a series of hurdles. It is an obstacle course made of silver and lace, and the reason it worked as a signal of pedigree is that you couldn't learn it overnight. You had to grow up in it. You had to have the muscle memory of pushing the spoon away and turning your head at the right moment. It is exactly what we see today with niche hobbies or specific travel destinations, things that require time and cultural capital, not just money.
That is why it is so effective for bluffing. If you can pull off these tiny, counterintuitive movements with total ease, you are signaling that this is your natural environment. You are saying, I am so comfortable in this world of absurd rules that I do not even have to think about them. It is the ultimate display of cultural capital. You also have to consider the epergne, that is spelled E-P-E-R-G-N-E, but pronounced I-pernen. It was a massive, elaborate centerpiece that often held candles, fruit, and flowers. The rule was that it had to be grand enough to signal wealth, but low enough that you could still see the person across from you. It was a very specific sweet spot of conspicuous restraint.
So, if we are looking at this from a 2026 perspective, why is this making a comeback in our imagination? Why are we fascinated by this level of choreography when we claim to want authenticity? Is it just that we are bored of eating over the sink?
I think it is because our modern social lives feel very shapeless. We meet up for coffee or a drink, and there is no structure. For people with social anxiety, which we know is at an all-time high right now, that lack of structure can actually be more stressful than a rigid set of rules. In 1875, you knew exactly what to do with your hands. You knew exactly who to talk to and when. There was a comfort in the script. Even if it was performative, it was predictable. You didn't have to worry about what to say because the hostess had already decided the topics.
That is a fair point. If you follow the script, you can't really fail as long as you know the lines. But there is also a darker side to it. All of this was designed to keep people out. It was a way of saying, you might have money now, but you will never have our history. You will never have our breeding. It was a way of enforcing a hierarchy that was starting to crumble in the face of the Industrial Revolution. It was a defensive crouch by the aristocracy.
As the middle class got richer and more powerful, the upper class made the rules of dinner more and more complex to maintain the distance. It was an arms race of etiquette. If the middle class learned how to use a fish knife, the upper class decided the fish knife was vulgar. It was a moving target. And we do the same thing today. The moment a fashion trend or a slang term becomes too mainstream, the elite move on to something even more obscure.
Which brings us to the Modern Bluffer's Guide. If you want to host a dinner party today that signals this kind of high society pedigree, you don't necessarily want to do the full 12 courses. That would just be annoying, and you would be doing dishes until 2027. But you can take the principles and apply them.
I agree. You want to focus on the choreography, not just the stuff. Use the turn of the table. It is a great way to ensure that no one at your party feels left out, and it makes you look like a master of social flow. Instead of just letting people talk, you can say, all right, we have heard enough about the turnips, let us hear about the Alps. You are taking control of the room. It feels authoritative.
And use the asparagus rule. Serve something that requires a very specific, slightly counterintuitive bit of etiquette. It creates a sense of an inside track. It makes the meal feel like an event rather than just a dinner. It turns your guests into participants in a play.
And for the love of everything, don't use a fish knife. If you serve fish, give them 2 forks. If anyone asks, just give them a knowing look and say, oh, we have always done it this way. It is the most powerful sentence in the English language for signaling pedigree. It implies a lineage that stretches back centuries, even if you just bought the forks on eBay last week.
It is the ultimate bluffer's tool. We have always done it this way. It shuts down all questions. It establishes your authority without you having to explain a thing. It is the verbal equivalent of a 6-foot-tall footman.
I think we should also mention the menu card again. Even if you are just serving a nice stew, print out a little card in French. Call it a ragout de boeuf. It adds a layer of theater that makes people realize this is not a casual Friday night. It is a performance, and by participating in it, they are being elevated too. You are inviting them into the club.
There's a certain generosity in that, actually. You are inviting your friends to play a role in a high-stakes drama. It is fun. It is a break from the messy, unchoreographed reality of modern life. It is a way to manage that 12.1% social anxiety by giving everyone a very clear set of instructions.
As long as you don't take it too seriously. The moment you start actually judging people for their soup spoon direction, you have become the villain in a Dickens novel. The key to the modern bluffer is to be in on the joke. You are performing the ritual, but you are doing it with a wink. You are acknowledging the absurdity while still enjoying the structure.
That is the sweet spot. Conspicuous restraint mixed with a bit of irony. It is how you navigate the social landscape of 2026 while still paying homage to the absurdly complex traditions of the past. It is about creating a moment that feels significant because it is difficult.
I think back to episode 1041 when we talked about life before refrigeration. The sheer amount of effort it took just to get fresh fish to a table in London was insane. When you realize that, the fish knife and the 12 courses start to make more sense. It was a way of celebrating the fact that you had conquered nature. You were eating fresh salmon in the middle of a city because you were powerful enough to make it happen. The dinner party was a victory lap for the industrial age.
And today, we have everything delivered to our door in 30 minutes by a guy on a moped. We have lost that sense of victory. Maybe that is why we are reaching back for these rituals. We want to feel like gathering together is an achievement again. We want to put on the show because the show makes the meal feel earned.
So, for our listeners who want to try this, what is the starter bluffers kit? What are the 3 things they should do to signal that pedigree?
Number 1, the 15-minute rule. Tell people dinner is at 8, but don't expect them until 8:15. If someone shows up at 8 exactly, give them a glass of water and make them wait in the hallway. I am joking mostly, but emphasize that timing matters. It creates a sense of occasion.
Number 2, the turn. Try it. It feels weird at first, but it is actually a very efficient way to manage a large table. As the host, you have the power to shift the entire energy of the room with a single tilt of your head. It is a rush. It makes you feel like a conductor.
And number 3, the hardware. You don't need 80 pieces of silver. Just get the glassware triangle right and hide the fish knives. Use 2 forks for the fish. It is the cheapest and most effective way to signal that you know a secret the rest of the world has forgotten. It is the original blue check mark.
And don't forget the savory course. Serve some cheese on toast or some sardines after the chocolate cake. It will confuse everyone, and you can just smile and say, it is a family tradition. It is the perfect way to end the night on a note of sophisticated bewilderment.
It is the perfect ending. It is baffling. It is unnecessary, and it is deeply sophisticated. It is the essence of the Victorian dinner party. It is about doing things the hard way because you can.
I think we have given them enough to be dangerous. Just remember, if you see someone drinking from the finger bowl, the polite thing to do is to drink from yours too, so they don't feel bad. That is the one rule of etiquette that actually matters, the one that makes you a truly great host. It is the humanity behind the architecture.
That is a beautiful sentiment, Herman. A bit of actual humanity in the middle of all that performative architecture. It turns out the best way to signal pedigree is to be kind enough to ignore when someone else lacks it.
Even a donkey can be a gentleman sometimes, Corn.
I will take your word for it. This has been a fascinating look at how we use the past to signal our status in the present. It turns out the fish knife was just the beginning of a very long and very complicated story about who we want to be.
Only much harder to polish than a social media profile.
True. Well, I think that is a good place to wrap this one up. We have covered the turn, the hardware, and the asparagus exception. I hope everyone feels a little more prepared for their next high-stakes social gathering in 2026.
Just remember, push the spoon away. Always push the spoon away. It is the difference between a guest and a glutton.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the show running smoothly. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to dive into these weird rabbit holes every week.
If you enjoyed this dive into the absurdity of Victorian manners, please leave us a review on your podcast app. It really helps other people find the show and join our weird little community of history nerds and social observers.
You can also find our full archive and all the ways to subscribe at myweirdprompts.com. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Goodbye, everyone.
See you next time.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from slow